I never thought my financial literacy would become my greatest asset and my greatest burden. For years, I managed the family investments while my sister spent her inheritance on failed ventures. Then came that Sunday dinner when my mother looked me in the eye and said, "Your sister deserves your trust fund more than you do." What happened next changed everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Responsibility has always been my defining characteristic. While other children dreamed of becoming astronauts or movie stars, I was the 8-year-old who created a savings plan for my allowance. My name is Eleanor Hayes, and by 32, I had built what most people would consider an enviable life. Senior financial analyst at a prestigious consulting firm in Chicago, a carefully curated apartment overlooking Lake Michigan, and enough financial stability to plan decades into the future. I lived by spreadsheets and 5-year plans, finding satisfaction in the predictable outcomes of disciplined choices. My father, Jonathan Hayes, had been cut from the same pragmatic cloth. "Financial independence is true freedom," he would tell me during our Sunday morning investment reviews, a ritual that began when I was 12. He was a self-made success story, the son of a mechanic who built a commercial real estate company through calculated risks and unwavering discipline. When he passed away 5 years ago, he left behind more than assets. He bequeathed a philosophy about money being a tool rather than a treasure. The complexity of his estate reflected his meticulous nature. The majority of his considerable wealth was divided into separate trust funds for his 2 daughters, myself and my younger sister, Rebecca. The structure was straightforward but specific. We would each receive quarterly distributions, with the principal becoming fully accessible at age 35. There was one notable difference between our trusts. While Rebecca's was conventional, mine came with a unique provision. As the family member with financial expertise, I was appointed co-trustee alongside Mr. Dominic Winters, my father's longtime attorney. "Your judgment in financial matters has always been sound, Ellie," my father had explained when reviewing his will during his final months. "This arrangement ensures you'll have both guidance and authority while protecting the family's financial future." The responsibility felt like a vote of confidence rather than a burden, at least initially. Rebecca and I could not have been more different in our approaches to life and money. Where I saw security in planning, she sought meaning in spontaneity. While I built my career methodically, she pursued her passions with remarkable intensity, but limited focus, cycling through career paths from gallery curator to sustainable fashion entrepreneur to nonprofit consultant, each venture beginning with enthusiasm and ending in financial distress. Our mother, Catherine Hayes, had always smoothed over these differences with a particular family narrative. "Eleanor is the practical one," she would say at family gatherings, "and Rebecca is our creative spirit." This benign-sounding distinction masked a deeper reality. My practicality was expected rather than celebrated, while Rebecca's creativity was indulged regardless of consequences. I didn't resent my monthly ritual of reviewing Rebecca's trust fund statements alongside my own. As co-trustee, I considered it part of my responsibility to monitor both accounts, ensuring everything remained in order. What did occasionally sting was the disparity in how these responsibilities were acknowledged. Mom routinely thanked Mr. Winters for his generous attention to our family's needs, while my identical efforts were simply expected. The pattern extended beyond financial matters. Every other weekend, I would make the 40-minute drive from my Chicago apartment to our family home in Lake Forest, where Mom still lived alone in the sprawling colonial that had been our childhood home. These visits followed a predictable schedule: arrival by 10 a.m. Saturday, immediate assessment of household maintenance needs, a carefully planned lunch, afternoon handling of any administrative tasks Mom had accumulated, dinner with her friends or neighbors, and Sunday brunch before returning to the city. Rebecca's visits, by contrast, occurred sporadically and typically coincided with a personal or financial crisis. She would arrive unannounced, stay for indeterminate periods, and leave my mother both emotionally drained and inexplicably rejuvenated by the whirlwind of drama. "Your sister needs me in a different way," Mom would explain when I pointed out the imbalance. What remained unspoken was the implication. Rebecca's needs were somehow more valid, more deserving of accommodation. Despite these frustrations, I maintained my routines with professional precision. My career continued to advance as I leveraged my analytical skills into a series of promotions. I developed a reputation for transforming struggling investment portfolios into models of steady growth. Nothing flashy, just consistently superior returns achieved through disciplined analysis and strategic decision-making. "Eleanor approaches risk like a chess master," my division director commented during my last performance review. "She sees 5 moves ahead while others are still deciding whether to move a pawn." The assessment pleased me, partly because it echoed my father's approach to both business and life. In my personal finances, I applied the same methodical strategy. Beyond my trust fund, which I largely left untouched, I had built a diversified investment portfolio and maintained a 6-month emergency fund. My apartment, while comfortable, represented a carefully calculated percentage of my income rather than the maximum I could afford. These choices weren't about deprivation, but about alignment with my values: security, independence, and the freedom that comes from financial self-sufficiency. This approach extended to my personal relationships as well. My circle was small but solid. Friendships built over years with people who understood my preference for depth over breadth in connections. My boyfriend James, an architectural engineer whose analytical mind complemented my own, had recently begun suggesting we consider moving in together, a proposition I was evaluating with my characteristic thoroughness. "You're the only person I know who would create a spreadsheet to analyze the emotional benefits of cohabitation," he had teased during our last dinner together, his affection evident despite the light mockery. "Informed decisions lead to better outcomes," I'd responded with a smile, comfortable in my methodical nature. What James understood, and what my family often missed, was that my analytical approach wasn't a limitation, but a different form of engagement with life. I felt things deeply, perhaps too deeply, and my systems provided a framework for managing those feelings without becoming overwhelmed by them. The spring weekend when everything changed began like any other. I arrived at my mother's house with a collection of financial statements requiring her signature, a new air purifier she had mentioned wanting, and a mental checklist of household maintenance tasks identified during my previous visit. The ornamental cherry trees lining the driveway were in full bloom, their pale pink blossoms creating a canopy that had once seemed magical to me as a child. Mom greeted me with her usual distracted affection, a quick hug before turning back to the phone conversation I had apparently interrupted. From her animated tone and repeated mentions of creative financing options, I immediately recognized she was speaking with Rebecca. "Eleanor's just arrived," she said into the phone. "Yes, I'll tell her. Love you too, darling." She disconnected the call and turned to me with an uncharacteristically bright smile. "Your sister sends her love. She's just had the most brilliant business opportunity come her way." I nodded, having heard variations of this statement at least, annually for the past decade. "That's nice. What is it this time?" "Don't use that tone, Eleanor," Mom chided, her smile fading. "Rebecca has connected with some extraordinary artisans in Peru who create these stunning textiles. She's going to import them for high-end interior designers. It's a perfect marriage of her creative eye and social consciousness." "Sounds interesting," I said neutrally, setting down my bags. "Has she secured import licenses, established distribution channels, created cash flow projections?" Mom waved away my questions, always so focused on the obstacles instead of the possibilities. "This is why Rebecca struggles to share her ventures with you. Not everything needs to be dissected before it's given a chance to live." I bit back a more pointed response about the previous ventures that had been given a chance to live, only to expire after consuming significant capital. Instead, I redirected the conversation to the household matters requiring attention, a strategy that had served me well in navigating family dynamics. The rest of Saturday proceeded according to the usual schedule. I replaced the water filter in the refrigerator, reprogrammed the temperamental thermostat, and spent 2 hours organizing Mom's tax documents while she tended to her garden. We shared a quiet dinner, during which she mentioned that Rebecca would be joining us for Sunday brunch, a deviation from the norm that sent a small warning signal flashing in my mind. That night, lying in my childhood bedroom beneath the same constellation map that had hung on the ceiling since I was 10, I found myself reflecting on the strange duality of my position in the family. I was simultaneously indispensable and invisible, the foundation everyone stood upon while looking elsewhere. My father had recognized my capabilities, entrusting me with significant responsibilities, yet even that acknowledgement had translated into additional obligations rather than true appreciation. As I drifted toward sleep, my phone chimed with a text message from Mr. Winters. Need to discuss trust matters. Can you call tomorrow afternoon? The timing seemed odd, especially on a weekend, but Mr. Winters was approaching 70 and had increasingly blurred the boundaries between his professional and personal schedules. I responded with a simple confirmation, unaware that this brief exchange was the prelude to a dramatic reshaping of my carefully structured world. Morning arrived with unseasonable warmth and the distant sound of my mother's voice, once again on the phone, her tone carrying the distinctive animation that only conversations with Rebecca could elicit. I showered and dressed with my usual efficiency, selecting a casual but put-together outfit that reflected my personal aesthetic, understated quality rather than flashy labels. When I descended to the kitchen, Mom was arranging pastries on her grandmother's china, the special occasion set that typically remained behind glass cabinet doors. Rebecca's bringing someone to brunch, she announced without preamble. A potential investor for her new business. I want everything to look perfect. The information settled uncomfortably. Sunday brunch had always been our quiet time together before my drive back to the city. Now it was being transformed into a business pitch meeting with no prior discussion. You might have mentioned that earlier, I said carefully. I have a call with Mr. Winters this afternoon and was planning to leave by 1. Mom's expression shifted to one I recognized all too well, disappointment tinged with subtle accusation. Surely you can adjust your schedule this once. Your sister needs family support right now. This investor could change everything for her. Before I could respond, the doorbell chimed, announcing Rebecca's arrival. As always, her presence immediately filled the house with a different energy, vibrant, unpredictable, and subtly demanding of attention. What I couldn't possibly have anticipated was how that energy would catalyze the events that would ultimately force me to redefine not just my role in the family, but my understanding of self-worth and the true meaning of financial independence. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Rebecca Hayes entered our mother's house like she was making an entrance on stage, which in many ways she was. At 30, my sister remained strikingly beautiful with our father's charismatic presence, and our mother's artistic sensibilities perfectly blended in her features. Today, she wore a vibrant dress adorned with what I immediately recognized as hand-woven Peruvian textiles. Her dark hair swept up in an artfully messy arrangement that probably took an hour to appear effortless. "Mom! Ellie!" She embraced our mother with theatrical enthusiasm before turning to me with a smile that conveyed genuine affection alongside something more complicated. Perhaps awareness of the imbalance between us, or simply the confidence of someone who has always been the family favorite. "You look so corporate even on a Sunday." I glanced down at my sensible slacks and cashmere sweater, Good to see you too, Becca. Behind her stood a man I didn't recognize, tall, silver-haired, and impeccably dressed in what appeared to be a bespoke suit. He carried himself with the unmistakable assurance of wealth, old money wealth, not the earned success my father had. Embodied. "This is Carlton Powell," Rebecca announced, linking her arm through his with practiced familiarity. "Carlton, my mother Catherine Hayes, and my sister Eleanor." "The financial genius of the family," he said as he shook my hand, his grip firm but his attention already shifting back to Rebecca. "I've heard quite a bit about you." Something in his tone suggested what he'd heard hadn't been entirely complimentary. I maintained my professional smile, the one I'd perfected during countless meetings with clients who underestimated me based on my age or gender. "All good things, I hope," I replied, noting how my mother beamed at this man she'd just met while Rebecca performed her signature move of appearing simultaneously humble and exceptional. "Carlton is considering becoming a cornerstone investor in Peruvian Textiles Reimagined," Rebecca explained as we moved toward the dining room. "PTR will transform how ethical luxury goods enter the American market." "How fascinating," Mom responded, guiding Carlton to what had been my father's seat at the head of the table, a placement that felt deliberately symbolic. "Eleanor works in finance too, but more conventional investments. Someone has to maintain stability while others innovate," I said, keeping my tone light while noting how quickly I'd been categorized as the boring counterpoint to Rebecca's visionary enterprise. As we settled into brunch, the dynamic established itself with familiar efficiency. Rebecca dominated the conversation, describing her vision for importing handcrafted textiles directly from indigenous artisans in Peru. Her passion was genuine, and, I had to admit, her concept had merit in an increasingly conscious consumer market. What her presentation lacked, as always, were concrete numbers, specific operational plans, or realistic assessments of regulatory hurdles. "The profit margins will be extraordinary," she assured Carlton as she delicately cut into her quiche. "We're talking at least 200% markup while still paying the artisans 4 times what they currently receive from local middlemen." I took a sip of water, restraining myself from pointing out the mathematical impossibility of her projection. If she was increasing supplier costs by 400% while maintaining competitive pricing in the luxury market, her margins couldn't possibly reach her target. "Sounds remarkable," Carlton commented, his expression revealing nothing about whether he found her projections credible. "What's your anticipated timeline to break even?" Rebecca waved her hand dismissively. "Conventional metrics don't really apply to disruptive models like PTR. We're building something transformative." She turned to me with sudden intensity. "Ellie understands this. She's been reviewing our family investments for years. Tell Carlton about how ethical investments often defy traditional ROI expectations." The abrupt spotlight felt like a trap. While I did believe in considering factors beyond immediate financial returns, Rebecca was clearly fishing for endorsement of her unrealistic projections. "Ethical investing certainly takes a broader view of value creation," I said carefully. "But sustainable businesses still need viable financial fundamentals." Rebecca's smile tightened slightly. "Always the pragmatist. This is why I handle the vision while Ellie manages the spreadsheets." "Someone needs to understand the numbers," I replied more pointedly than I'd intended. "Ladies," our mother intervened with a nervous laugh, "let's not turn brunch into a business debate. Carlton isn't here to referee sisterly disagreements." "On the contrary," Carlton said, looking more interested than he had all morning. "Family dynamics around wealth can be quite revealing. My own siblings and I have had our share of philosophical differences about money." "There's no real disagreement," Mom insisted. "Eleanor is simply more cautious by nature. Rebecca has always been willing to take inspired risks, just like her father." I nearly choked on my water. Our father had indeed taken risks, but they had been meticulously calculated ones backed by exhaustive research and contingency planning. Nothing like Rebecca's impulsive ventures. Dad believed in careful analysis before commitment, I said quietly. He built his success on discipline, not impulse. Your father also understood that opportunity doesn't wait for perfect certainty, Mom countered, her tone sharpening. He would have appreciated Rebecca's entrepreneurial spirit. The rewriting of my father's business philosophy was nothing new, but it still stung, particularly when used to bolster Rebecca's claim to his legacy, while diminishing my connection to his actual values and methods. Speaking of your father, Carlton interjected smoothly, Rebecca mentioned that he established rather substantial trust funds for both of you. That level of security must provide significant freedom to pursue your respective paths. The directness of the question about our personal finances was startling, especially from someone who had entered our lives less than an hour ago. Before I could formulate an appropriately vague response, Rebecca jumped in. Dad believed in empowering us financially, she said. Though the trusts are structured differently, Ellie has co-trustee status on hers. Dad's acknowledgement of her financial acumen. Mine is more conventional. Interesting arrangement, Carlton commented, his gaze shifting between us with new assessment. And the distributions are identical. Quarterly, same amounts, Rebecca confirmed with surprising openness about details I considered private, though the principal becomes fully accessible at 35. Which is still 5 years away for both of you, our mother added, then turned to me with an expectant look. Though as co-trustee, Eleanor has certain additional flexibilities. The implication hung in the air, its meaning unmistakable. This brunch wasn't merely about introducing Carlton as a potential investor. A coordinated agenda was unfolding, one that apparently required discussing trust details I'd always considered confidential family matters. The trustee arrangements are designed to protect the assets, I said neutrally. Mr. Winters and I take that responsibility seriously. Dominic Winters, Carlton repeated thoughtfully. From Winters and Associates? I believe we serve on the symphony board together. Remarkable legal mind. He's been the family attorney for decades, Mom confirmed. Though as Eleanor mentioned, perhaps overly conservative in his approach to trust management. Another piece clicked into place. Not only was Rebecca seeking investment from Carlton, but she'd selected him specifically because of his connection to Mr. Winters, a connection that might potentially influence trust decisions. Mr. Winters adheres to the parameters established by Dad's will, I said, abandoning pretense. As do I. Rebecca leaned forward, her expression earnest. But those parameters include provisions for extraordinary distributions when justified by worthwhile investments. Dad would have wanted his legacy to help us grow, not just provide quarterly allowances. And there it was, the real purpose behind this elaborate performance. Rebecca wasn't just seeking external investment for her latest venture. She wanted access to trust principal that would normally be locked until she turned 35. PTR requires significant initial capital, she continued, turning to address Carlton directly. Having cornerstone investors like yourself provides credibility, but family backing demonstrates true commitment to the vision. Our mother nodded approvingly. Jonathan always believed in supporting promising ventures. I'm certain he would have wanted his daughters to collaborate on something this meaningful. The carefully orchestrated pressure was all too familiar, but the stakes had never been this explicit before. They weren't just suggesting that Rebecca deserved additional trust distributions for her business. The implication was that I should facilitate this as co-trustee, potentially going against the specific provisions my father had established. Any significant distributions outside the standard schedule would require thorough documentation and approval from both trustees, I explained, maintaining a professional tone despite my growing discomfort. Business investments have specific criteria that must be met. Documentation can be arranged, Rebecca said dismissively. It's really about whether you believe in me, Ellie. And with that simple redefinition, Financial responsibility became a test of familial loyalty. It was no longer about sound investment principles or fiduciary duty, but about proving my support for my sister. The maneuvering was so skillful I might have admired it had I not been its target. "I have a call scheduled with Mr. Winters this afternoon," I said, glancing at my watch. Perhaps this would be a good topic to discuss with him. "Wonderful idea," Mom exclaimed, as if I'd suggested something entirely different than professional consultation. "I've always said your administrative talents are invaluable, Eleanor." The reduction of my financial expertise to administrative talents was a familiar diminishment, but today it carried additional weight given Carlton's presence. She was positioning Rebecca as the visionary entrepreneur while casting me as the glorified clerk, a narrative that conveniently supported their objective of accessing trust funds. Carlton observed this exchange with the shrewd assessment of someone accustomed to identifying leverage in relationships. "Family support certainly strengthens investor confidence," he noted, "but ultimately, the business concept must stand on its own merits." "Which is exactly why I'd want to see a comprehensive business plan," I added, seizing the opening. "Projected cash flows, market analysis, regulatory compliance strategy, supplier contracts, all the elements that would be required for any serious investment consideration." Rebecca's expression flickered between annoyance and calculation. "I can have preliminary projections to you this week, but this opportunity won't wait indefinitely, Ellie. Sometimes you have to trust vision over spreadsheets." "I trust data," I replied simply, as did Dad. Mom set down her coffee cup with deliberate precision. "Your father also trusted people, Eleanor, particularly family. He would be disappointed by this unnecessary skepticism toward your sister's endeavors." The invocation of my father's supposed disappointment was the final maneuver in their well-practiced strategy, an emotional gambit designed to override my professional judgment with familial guilt. In previous years, it might have worked, or at least left me questioning my position. Today, however, something had shifted. Perhaps it was the transparency of their coordinated approach, or Carlton's presence highlighting the manipulation I'd normalized for years. As the meal concluded and we moved to the living room for coffee, I excused myself to prepare for my call with Mr. Winters. In the privacy of my father's former study, I took a moment to collect my thoughts, gazing at the familiar arrangement of business books and family photographs that still occupied his shelves 5 years after his passing. My eyes settled on a particular photo, my college graduation, with Dad standing beside me, his expression conveying unmistakable pride as I held my finance degree with honors. He had understood what I was only beginning to grasp, that my financial acumen wasn't merely a useful skill but a form of protection. He had made me co-trustee not as an administrative burden but as a safeguard, both for the family wealth and, perhaps, for me. When my phone rang at precisely 2 p.m., I answered with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. "Mr. Winters, perfect timing. It seems we have some important matters to discuss." What I couldn't have anticipated was that this conversation would reveal information that would fundamentally alter my understanding of my father's intentions and my place within the family legacy he had so carefully constructed. "Eleanor, thank you for making time on a Sunday." Mr. Winters' voice carried the formal precision that had characterized all our interactions since my father's passing. "I apologize for the unusual timing, but certain developments require immediate attention." I settled into my father's leather chair, automatically straightening the desk blotter as I had seen him do countless times. "I appreciate your call, especially today. There have been some interesting discussions regarding the trusts this morning." "Indeed." The slight pause suggested he already knew something of what had transpired. "That's partly why I'm calling. I received an unusual email from your mother late last night, followed by a phone call from someone named Carlton Powell this morning. My suspicions confirmed, I felt a strange combination of vindication and disappointment. Carlton is currently in our living room. Apparently, he's considering investing in Rebecca's latest business venture, importing textiles from Peru. Ah. The single syllable contained volumes of understanding. And I presume this venture requires substantial capital investment, which Rebecca hopes will come partly from her trust fund, accessing principal well before the age stipulation. I kept my voice low, aware of the thin walls separating the study from the rest of the house. She's positioned it as a special circumstance that would warrant extraordinary distributions. As I suspected, Mr. Winters cleared his throat. Eleanor, what I'm about to share falls under attorney-client privilege, though in this case the client was your father. Under normal circumstances, I would maintain confidentiality indefinitely, but Jonathan included specific provisions authorizing disclosure of certain information if particular situations arose. My grip tightened on the phone. What kind of situations? Precisely what appears to be developing. Pressure to release substantial trust assets for speculative ventures. His voice took on a more personal tone than I'd ever heard from him. Your father was remarkably perceptive about family dynamics. He anticipated potential conflicts arising from differing financial philosophies. The implication that my father had foreseen this exact scenario, my mother and sister attempting to circumvent trust provisions, sent a chill through me. Had the past 5 years of supporting Rebecca's ventures while maintaining trust boundaries been inevitable rather than circumstantial? What exactly did he anticipate? I asked. Jonathan recognized that Rebecca's financial approach mirrored your mother's more than his own. Both tend toward optimism over pragmatism, emotion over analysis. He admired their creative thinking, but worried about their vulnerability to persuasive investment opportunities. This assessment aligned perfectly with my observations, but hearing it articulated by someone who had known my father so well gave it unexpected weight. He also recognized that you inherited his analytical approach to finance, what he called the discipline of patience. He spoke often of your ability to evaluate opportunities without emotional interference. I swallowed against a sudden tightness in my throat. These were qualities my mother frequently characterized as limitations, evidence of my rigidity, or lack of vision. To hear them described as strengths my father had valued felt like recovering a piece of myself long dismissed. This is why he structured the trusts as he did, Mr. Winters continued. Not out of unequal affection or trust, but from clear-eyed assessment of his daughter's different relationships with money. My mother sees it differently, I said quietly. She believes Rebecca deserves greater access because she's willing to take inspired risks with the capital. Mr. Winters' sigh carried the weight of familiarity with this argument. Catherine has always believed in the mythology of the bold entrepreneur, the visionary unbounded by conventional constraints. Jonathan balanced this perspective throughout their marriage, though not without considerable effort. The characterization illuminated decades of family dinner conversations where my mother championed instinct-driven decision-making while my father gently emphasized research and planning. I had always aligned with my father's approach, a position that increasingly isolated me after his death. Eleanor, there's something specific you need to know. Mr. Winters' tone became more serious. Your role as co-trustee isn't merely administrative or honorary. Jonathan included a specific provision, what he called the preservation clause, that gives either trustee veto power over extraordinary distributions if we determine they conflict with the long-term security objectives of the trust. I straightened in the chair. Veto power? Even against the other trustees' approval? Precisely. It requires only one trustee to block distributions deemed excessively risky. Both trustees must affirmatively approve extraordinary disbursements, but either can decline independently. This was significant. I had always operated under the assumption that Mr. Winters, as the senior trustee and family attorney, held final authority. The knowledge that I possessed equal power to protect the trusts shifted my understanding of my father's intentions. Your father wanted to ensure that even if pressured by family expectations or emotional appeals, the trusts would remain protected until both you and Rebecca reached full financial maturity. He believed 35 was the minimum age at which most people develop the perspective necessary for managing substantial wealth. The insight explained so much about my father's careful estate planning, which I had previously interpreted primarily as tax optimization rather than psychological foresight. There's more, Mr. Winters continued. The trust documents contain contingency provisions that activate under specific circumstances. One such provision addresses repeated attempts to circumvent the age restrictions through business investment claims. What sort of provision? I asked, intrigued by my father's extraordinary foresight. If 3 or more investment-based distribution requests are submitted within an 18-month period, and these requests are deemed speculative rather than prudent, the trust converts to a more restrictive structure, with quarterly distributions reduced by 25% until the principal distribution age is reached. I almost laughed at the elegant simplicity of the mechanism. My father had created a financial circuit breaker, a system that would automatically impose greater restrictions if signs of impulsive financial behavior emerged. The provision wasn't punitive, but protective, designed to prevent trust depletion through serial entrepreneurial ventures. Has Rebecca already submitted formal requests that would count toward this threshold? I asked. 2 in the past year, Mr. Winters confirmed. One for her sustainable fashion marketplace last spring, which was declined based on inadequate business planning. Another for a wellness retreat center in Arizona 3 months ago, withdrawn when she was asked to provide detailed financial projections. Neither venture had progressed beyond the concept stage, yet both had apparently advanced far enough to involve formal trust distribution requests. I wondered how many other ideas had been abandoned before reaching that threshold. And now, the Peruvian textile import business, I murmured, connecting the pattern, which would constitute the 3rd request within the specified time frame, Mr. Winters concluded. The implications were significant. If Rebecca formally submitted this request, and it was denied based on insufficient planning or excessive risk, the protective mechanism would trigger automatically, reducing her quarterly distributions by 25% for the next 5 years until she reached 35. Does Rebecca know about this provision? I asked. The general trust structure was explained to both of you after your father's passing, but Jonathan specifically instructed that certain protective mechanisms not be detailed unless activated. He felt that foreknowledge might lead to strategic behavior intended to circumvent their purpose. My father's psychological insight continued to impress me. He had understood that explaining every protective measure might simply provide a roadmap for avoiding them. Mr. Winters, what would you advise at this point? I asked, genuinely uncertain about the most responsible course of action. My professional instincts urged transparency, informing Rebecca and our mother about the potential consequences before any formal request was submitted. Yet my growing awareness of the pattern suggested such information might simply lead to more sophisticated manipulation rather than genuine reflection. Professionally, I must maintain neutrality as trustee, he replied carefully. However, speaking as someone who valued your father greatly and respects his intentions, I would suggest 3 considerations. First, the trusts were designed primarily for security, not venture capital. Second, your co-trustee role carries fiduciary responsibility to the beneficiaries' long-term interests, not their immediate desires. And third, sometimes true support means maintaining boundaries rather than removing them. His measured wisdom resonated with my own emerging clarity about the situation. Thank you, that's helpful perspective. There's one final matter we should discuss, Mr. Winters added, his tone shifting. Your mother's email included something concerning. She suggested that if necessary, she would consider legal action to modify the trust terms, potentially challenging your role as co-trustee. The statement hit like a physical blow. On what grounds? Her argument, though not formally presented, implies that your personal relationship with your sister creates a conflict of interest that prevents objective financial judgment. She suggested that family dynamics are interfering with appropriate trust administration. The irony was almost too perfect. My caution regarding Rebecca's ventures, caution directly aligned with my father's explicitly stated intentions, was being reframed as personal bias, warranting my removal as trustee. Is that a viable legal strategy? I asked, my analytical mind immediately assessing the threat. Highly unlikely to succeed, Mr. Winters assured me. Your father's documentation regarding his intentions was meticulous, and your financial expertise makes you objectively qualified for the role. However, the attempt itself could create significant family conflict and legal expenses, which would be paid from trust assets. The calculation was becoming clear. My mother and sister were positioning to either secure trust funds for Rebecca's business, or, failing that, to challenge my trustee role through legal means that would deplete the very assets my father had worked to protect. One more question, I said, processing this information. If such a challenge were attempted, would the trust documents be entered into court records? Most likely, yes, including all protective provisions and your father's stated rationale. For them. Meaning Rebecca and my mother would learn about the circuit breaker provision and other protective mechanisms my father had established, potentially damaging family relationships permanently. I need to think about how to proceed, I said finally. Of course. Mr. Winters' voice carried unexpected warmth. Eleanor, if I may offer a personal observation, your father spoke of you with remarkable pride, not just for your financial acumen, but for your integrity. He believed you would make difficult decisions when necessary, even when they might be initially misunderstood by those you care about. The validation from this man who had known my father so well brought unexpected emotion. Thank you. That means a great deal. After ending the call, I remained in my father's study, absorbing the implications of what I'd learned. The weight of responsibility had just grown considerably, but alongside it came a newfound understanding of my father's trust in me, not just as a financial analyst, but as someone who would protect his legacy in its truest sense. Through the closed door, I could hear the murmur of voices from the living room, my mother's animated tone, Rebecca's occasional laugh, and Carlton's measured responses. They were continuing their performance, unaware that the script had fundamentally changed. I opened my laptop and logged into the secure portal where trust documents were stored, navigating to sections I had previously reviewed only superficially. Reading my father's detailed provisions with new context, I found myself impressed by his foresight and the careful balance he had struck between generosity and protection. One passage particularly stood out, not a legal provision, but a personal note included in the confidential trustee guidance. Financial security creates the foundation for authentic choices. Without it, creativity becomes desperation and passion becomes vulnerability. I established these structures not to control my daughter's lives from beyond, but to ensure they can build lives truly their own, guided by aspiration rather than necessity. In these words, I recognized my father's true intention. The trusts weren't about money, ultimately, but about freedom. The freedom that comes from security, from options, from the ability to pursue passion without being driven by financial pressure. He had understood that real independence required both resources and the wisdom to manage them well. As I closed the laptop, my phone buzzed with a text from Rebecca. Wrapping up with Carlton soon. Need to talk before you leave. Important. I took a deep breath, preparing myself for the conversation ahead. The path forward wasn't yet clear, but my father's guidance, both through legal structures and personal wisdom, had given me a compass. Whatever came next, I would navigate it with a clearer understanding of both my responsibility and my purpose as guardian of not just assets, but opportunities. The burden of that responsibility felt different now, not heavier, necessarily, but more meaningful. This wasn't just about money or family dynamics. It was about honoring a legacy of thoughtful stewardship and ensuring that both Rebecca and I would ultimately have the security needed for genuine self-determination. With that perspective settling into conviction, I rose from my father's chair and prepared to face whatever came next, not just as the practical daughter or the financial one, but as Eleanor Hayes, trustee and guardian of possibilities my father had valued enough to protect with his characteristic foresight and care. When I emerged from my father's study, the atmospheric pressure in the house had shifted. Carlton had departed, leaving my mother and Rebecca in a tableau of conspiratorial closeness on the living room sofa. Their animated conversation halted, abruptly when I appeared in the doorway, replaced by expectant looks that made their agenda transparent. "There she is," Rebecca said, patting the space beside her. "Join us, Ellie. We've been having the most productive conversation about PTR's potential." I remained standing, noting how they had positioned themselves, physically and metaphorically, as a united front. "I imagine you have. How did things conclude with Carlton?" "Brilliantly," Rebecca beamed. "He's preliminarily committed to a cornerstone investment of $150,000, contingent on securing matching funds from aligned investors." Her air quotes around the phrase made clear who those investors were expected to be. "That's a significant commitment," I acknowledged, genuinely impressed if it was true. Carlton had struck me as too shrewd to make substantial commitments. After a single meeting. "He recognizes extraordinary potential when he sees it," my mother interjected, her pride in Rebecca radiating like a physical force. "He particularly mentioned the social impact aspect, how PTR will create sustainable income for Indigenous artisans while introducing their cultural heritage to high-end consumers. The business model needs refinement," Rebecca added with unusual candor. "But the core concept is solid, which brings me to what we wanted to discuss with you." She exchanged a quick glance with our mother. "I'll be submitting a formal request for a special distribution from my trust fund, $200,000, to provide both matching for Carlton's investment and necessary startup capital." The directness was unexpected. Previous ventures had typically involved more elaborate preambles, emotional appeals, and strategic guilt deployment before arriving at specific financial requests. "That's a substantial amount," I observed neutrally. "Well beyond the parameters for special distributions outlined in the trust documents. Parameters can be interpreted flexibly when warranted," my mother countered. "Dominic has become unnecessarily rigid in his administration since your father passed. Jonathan would have wanted his assets used to empower his daughters, not constrain them." The invocation of my father's supposed wishes, directly contradicting what Mr. Winters had just shared about his actual intentions, might once have made me doubt my own understanding. Today, it merely confirmed how thoroughly my mother had convinced herself of a narrative that aligned with her preferences. "I've drafted a comprehensive business plan," Rebecca continued, gesturing toward a leather portfolio on the coffee table. "Complete with market analysis, supplier agreements, and 5-year projections. Everything you and Dominic would need to evaluate the opportunity properly." This, too, represented a departure from previous patterns. Rebecca's ventures typically existed primarily in concept form, with details to be determined once funding was secured. The existence of actual documentation suggested either newfound seriousness or Carlton's influence in professionalizing her approach. "I'd like to review that," I said, taking a seat in the armchair opposite them rather than the offered space, on the sofa. A proper evaluation would require thorough analysis of the projections and underlying assumptions. "Of course," Rebecca agreed readily. I know you'll need to do your due diligence. But time is a factor here. The artisan cooperative in Peru is entertaining offers from other importers. We have a narrow window to secure exclusive arrangements. The familiar pressure of urgency, a tactic that had facilitated numerous impulsive decisions throughout Rebecca's financial history. Create a sense of limited time, emphasize the opportunity cost of careful analysis, accelerate decision-making before full implications can be assessed. How narrow is this window? I asked, maintaining a professional tone despite recognizing the manipulation. 2 weeks, maximum, Rebecca replied promptly. Carlton is prepared to move quickly if we demonstrate family commitment to matching his investment. I reached for the portfolio, opening it to find surprisingly detailed documents, professional quality, financial projections, supplier profiles, and marketing strategies. The material was impressive at first glance, though I would need time to evaluate its substance beyond presentation. I'll need to consult with Mr. Winters, of course, I said, flipping through the pages. Trust distributions of this magnitude require both trustees' approval. About that, my mother interjected, her tone shifting to one I recognized as her approach to difficult conversations. We've been thinking that perhaps Dominic's involvement has become unnecessarily complicating. I looked up from the portfolio. Complicating how? He's approaching retirement age, she continued carefully. His perspective is naturally becoming more conservative, more risk-averse. Your father selected him when the circumstances were quite different. The trust documents specifically name Mr. Winters as co-trustee, I pointed out. That's not a role that changes based on perceived shifts in perspective. Trust arrangements can be modified when they no longer serve their intended purpose, my mother countered, her voice taking on the authoritative tone she had often used to end discussions when I was younger. There are legal mechanisms for updating outdated provisions. And there it was, the implied threat Mr. Winters had mentioned, now presented as a reasonable adjustment to changing circumstances rather than the aggressive legal maneuver it would actually represent. Modifying established trust documents would require substantial legal proceedings, I said evenly. Expensive, time-consuming, and with no guaranteed outcome. Hopefully unnecessary, Rebecca interjected, her tone deliberately conciliatory. If the current trustees recognize the validity of this investment opportunity, no modifications would be needed. This is why I've prepared such comprehensive documentation, to demonstrate that PTR is exactly the kind of venture Dad would have supported. The coordinated approach was impressive in its execution, my mother playing the authority willing to pursue aggressive legal options if necessary, Rebecca positioning herself as the reasonable middle ground seeking cooperation rather than conflict. They had clearly refined this dynamic during my absence in the study. I'll review the business plan thoroughly, I promised, closing the portfolio. But I should be transparent about something. Mr. Winters and I just had a lengthy conversation about trust administration, including the specific parameters for extraordinary distributions. A flicker of concern crossed my mother's face. What did Dominic have to say? He provided important context about Dad's intentions regarding the trusts, I replied carefully. Including his philosophy about the purpose of the financial security he established for us. Dominic's interpretation of your father's intentions isn't definitive, my mother said dismissively. I was married to Jonathan for 35 years. I understood his values and priorities more deeply than his attorney ever could. Perhaps, I acknowledged, unwilling to debate this point when I knew the trust documents themselves contained my father's explicit guidance. Regardless, any distribution request will need to be evaluated according to established criteria. The business plan appears detailed, which is a positive start. Rebecca leaned forward, her expression earnest. Ellie, I need you to understand something. This isn't just another business idea for me. PTR represents everything I've been working toward combining ethical business practices with cultural appreciation and artistic expression. It's the first venture that truly feels aligned with who I am and what I value. Her sincerity seemed genuine, which made the situation more complex rather than less. Rebecca's passion had never been in question. Her capacity for disciplined execution was the consistent variable that undermined her entrepreneurial efforts. "I believe you care deeply about this concept," I said carefully. "The question isn't about your passion, but about the viability of the business model and the appropriateness of using trust principle, assets intended for long-term security, to fund an inherently risky startup venture. Sometimes security means taking calculated risks," Rebecca countered. "Dad took risks building his business. He wouldn't have wanted us to be so conservative that we miss valuable opportunities." Again, the selective interpretation of our father's approach, emphasizing his entrepreneurial spirit while omitting his methodical risk assessment and disciplined capital allocation. Dad built his business with retained earnings and careful growth, not large speculative investments, I reminded her. He was strategic, not impulsive. "This isn't impulsive." Rebecca's composure cracked slightly, revealing the emotional investment beneath her polished presentation. "I've spent months developing this concept. I've visited the artisan communities in Peru. I've researched import regulations and retail distribution channels. This isn't like the wellness retreat or the sustainable fashion marketplace. This is different." Her frustration at being measured against her previous ventures was understandable, yet those earlier failures remained relevant in assessing her current proposal. Pattern recognition was a fundamental aspect of risk evaluation, a principle our father had emphasized throughout his business career. "I hope it is different," I said sincerely, "and I'll review your business plan with that possibility in mind. But I need to be clear about something. My responsibility as trustee is to the long-term financial security the trusts were designed to provide." That's not dinner that evening transformed the simmering tension into something far more volatile. What had begun as subtle maneuvering escalated into a confrontation that would permanently alter our family's dynamics. Mother had insisted I stay rather than return to Chicago as planned, arguing that we needed to resolve this situation as a family. She prepared an elaborate meal. Her strategic approach to difficult conversations had always involved the disarming comforts of food and familiar ritual. Rebecca helped in the kitchen while I set the dining table, each of us performing our established roles in the family choreography despite the undercurrents threatening its familiar rhythms. The meal began pleasantly enough with discussions of neutral topics, a neighbor's landscaping project, an upcoming exhibit at the Art Institute, a human interest story from the morning news. I recognized this as the calm before the storm, Mother's typical approach of establishing normalcy before introducing conflict. "I spoke with Carlton after you left," Rebecca mentioned casually as she served herself another portion of roasted vegetables. "He was quite impressed with our family, particularly with Dad's business legacy." "He seemed like an astute businessman," I acknowledged, "though rather direct about financial matters for someone you've just introduced to the family." Mother set down her wine glass with deliberate precision. "Carlton and Rebecca have been developing their professional relationship for several months. Today wasn't an introduction so much as an integration, bringing together Rebecca's personal and professional connections. The revelation that Carlton's appearance wasn't the spontaneous introduction it had been presented as confirmed my suspicion that a coordinated strategy was unfolding. The chance meeting with a potential investor who happened to know Mr. Winters, the surprisingly detailed business plan, the escalating pressure for immediate trust distributions, all elements of a carefully orchestrated campaign. "I see," I said, maintaining my composure. "That context would have been helpful earlier." "Perhaps," Mother conceded, "but you tend to be unnecessarily skeptical of Rebecca's professional connections. We wanted Carlton to make his own impression without preconceptions." The "we" was telling, Mother positioning herself as Rebecca's business partner rather than our parent. This blurring of roles had become increasingly pronounced over the years, with Mother shifting from parental guidance to active participation in Rebecca's ventures, co-signing loans, providing emergency funds when projects faltered, and repeatedly rebuilding the narrative when reality failed to match expectations. "I've reviewed your business plan," I said to Rebecca, deciding to redirect the conversation to substantive matters. "The concept has merit, but the financial projections seem optimistic, particularly regarding import costs and retail markup sustainability." Rebecca straightened, clearly prepared for this critique. "The projections are based on actual supplier quotes and comparable luxury goods pricing. PTR will operate on a direct-to-designer model that eliminates traditional retail markup while maintaining premium positioning. Even with that model, your projected margins exceed industry standards by nearly 40%, I pointed out. And the marketing budget seems insufficient for establishing a luxury brand presence in a crowded ethical goods marketplace. The business model innovates beyond conventional industry standards," Rebecca countered with practiced confidence. "Traditional metrics don't capture the value proposition of authentic cultural artifacts with documented provenance and artisan relationships." The response sounded rehearsed, likely developed with Carlton's coaching to address anticipated objections. It employed the classic entrepreneurial tactic of dismissing standard evaluation criteria by claiming exceptional status for the venture in question. "Innovation doesn't exempt a business from financial fundamentals," I replied. "Cash flow remains. Cash flow regardless of how unique the value proposition might be." Mother set down her fork with uncharacteristic force. "This constant negativity toward your sister's endeavors has become tiresome, Eleanor. Not everything requires your approval or understanding." "This isn't about approval," I clarified. "It's about responsible evaluation of a business proposal, seeking significant trust distributions. That's my role as co-trustee, a role Dad specifically established. Your father couldn't have anticipated how your relationship with your sister would develop," Mother said, her tone sharpening, "or how your professional jealousy would color your judgment regarding her opportunities." The accusation, presented as established fact rather than her interpretation, struck with practiced precision. Mother had always excelled at reframing legitimate concerns as personal failings, particularly when those concerns threatened her preferred narrative. "This isn't about jealousy," I said evenly. "It's about fiduciary responsibility to ensure trust assets are deployed appropriately, according to the parameters Dad established." "Parameters, provisions, responsibilities," Mother enumerated with mounting frustration. "You hide behind technical language while failing to honor the spirit of your father's intentions. Jonathan believed in supporting his daughter's dreams, not obstructing them with bureaucratic obstacles." The fundamental disconnect was becoming clearer with each exchange. Mother genuinely believed that my father's estate planning had been primarily intended to fund our aspirations rather than provide long-term security, a perspective utterly at odds with what Mr. Winters had confirmed about his actual documented intentions. Rebecca, who had been observing our exchange with calculated restraint, leaned forward. "Ellie, I understand your caution. My track record with previous ventures hasn't inspired confidence, but I've learned from those experiences. PTR represents real growth, professionally and personally." Her acknowledgement of past failures was unexpected, a departure from the typical pattern of dismissing previous ventures as valuable learning experiences rather than genuine setbacks. This new approach suggested either sincere evolution or a more sophisticated persuasion strategy. "I appreciate that perspective," I acknowledged, "and I genuinely hope this venture proves more successful than previous attempts. But hope isn't a sufficient basis for fiduciary decisions regarding trust. Assets. Perhaps the issue isn't with Rebecca's ventures, but with the unnecessarily restrictive trust structure," Mother suggested, pursuing a new angle. "Your father established these arrangements when you were both much younger. He would have expected adjustments as you matured and developed your own paths. The trust specifically maintains restrictions until age 35, I reminded her. That wasn't arbitrary but deliberate. Dad's assessment of when financial maturity typically develops. Your sister has demonstrated remarkable growth already, Mother countered. She doesn't need to be 35 to make sound business decisions. Then she shouldn't need trust distributions to fund her venture, I replied. Truly viable businesses attract external investment based on their merits. Carlton's commitment suggests that pathway is already opening. The family should lead by example, Rebecca interjected. Outside investors want to see that those closest to the venture have skin in the game. That's Business 101. Using trust. Principle intended for long-term security isn't the appropriate form of skin in the game, I countered. That's Financial Responsibility 101. The exchange continued in this circular pattern, each of us retreating to increasingly entrenched positions. As the meal progressed, I sensed a shift in their approach, a growing frustration with my unwillingness to yield, culminating in what would become the catalyst for everything that followed. Mother set down her napkin with deliberate finality and exchanged a glance with Rebecca before turning to me with uncharacteristic directness. Eleanor, there's something we need to discuss that goes beyond this particular business opportunity. Something more fundamental about your father's legacy and its purpose. The abrupt shift in tone alerted me that we had reached the core of their agenda, the real purpose behind the elaborate Sunday orchestration. Your father established these trusts to provide for his daughter's futures, Mother continued. Not as abstract financial entities, but as support for the actual lives you would build. The question we must confront is whether the current arrangement truly serves that intention. The trusts are functioning exactly as designed, I pointed out, providing quarterly distributions while protecting principal until we reach the age Dad deemed appropriate for full access. That's a technical assessment, not a human one, Mother countered. The reality before us is that these identical trusts are supporting two very different daughters with very different needs and contributions. Rebecca remained silent, her expression deliberately neutral as Mother continued what was clearly a prepared statement. You've built a successful career, Eleanor. Your financial acumen has secured you a position that provides substantial income and stability independent of your trust. You've chosen a path that prioritizes security and predictability. Admirable qualities, certainly, but not qualities that require significant capital investment. The direction of her argument was becoming clear, though I couldn't yet see its ultimate destination. Financial security isn't something you outgrow or become less entitled to because you've made responsible choices. No one is suggesting you aren't entitled to security, Mother assured me with practiced reasonableness. The question is whether the rigid equal division of your father's estate best serves his intentions when his daughter's situations have diverged so significantly. Dad divided his estate equally because he valued us equally, I stated firmly. That was his explicit intention, documented clearly in his will and trust instruments. Mother took a deep breath, exchanging another glance with Rebecca before delivering the statement that would shatter any remaining pretense of normal family dinner conversation. After considerable reflection, I've come to believe your sister deserves your trust fund more than you do. The words hung in the air with stunning clarity. Not that Rebecca deserved access to her own trust funds, or even additional distributions from the family estate, but that she deserved my trust fund, the funds my father had specifically designated for my long-term security. Excuse me? Managed, certain I had misunderstood. You've secured your future through your career choices, Mother continued, her voice gaining confidence as she articulated what had clearly been extensively considered. Rebecca needs capital investment to establish her path. Your father would have adjusted his estate planning to reflect these different requirements had he lived to see how your situations evolved. The audacity of the claim, presented not as a radical proposition but as a self-evident truth, momentarily left me speechless. Rebecca at least had the grace to look uncomfortable with the directness of Mother's statement, though she made no move to contradict it. "Let me understand this correctly," I said once I'd gathered my composure. "You believe that because I've worked hard to build financial stability through my career, I am somehow less entitled to the inheritance Dad specifically designated for me? That Rebecca deserves both her trust fund and mine because she hasn't established similar security?" "You're deliberately mischaracterizing my position," Mother said, her tone hardening. "This isn't about entitlement, but about need and potential. Your sister's ventures require capital that you simply don't need, given your chosen path." The fundamental injustice of the proposition collided with years of accumulated frustration. The consistent pattern of my contributions being minimized while Rebecca's potential was elevated, of my reliability being expected while her unpredictability was accommodated, of my boundaries being characterized as selfishness while her demands were framed as legitimate needs. "That's not how inheritance works," I said finally, my voice steadier than I felt. "Dad's estate planning wasn't a provisional arrangement to be redistributed based on your assessment of our comparative worthiness. The trusts are legal entities, with explicit terms, not family resources subject to ongoing reallocation. Legal structures can be modified when they no longer serve their intended purpose," Mother insisted, "with proper petition to the courts." "You're suggesting legal action to take my inheritance and give it to Rebecca," I interrupted, needing the absurdity of the proposition stated plainly. "Because I've been financially responsible while she hasn't." "I'm suggesting that your father's assets should be deployed where they can create the most meaningful impact," Mother countered. "Rebecca's business represents exactly the kind of opportunity Jonathan would have wanted to support. Your opposition isn't protecting his legacy, it's constraining it." Something crystallized in that moment, a recognition that this wasn't merely about a business investment or even about trust distributions. It was about a fundamental worldview in which my choices would always be valued less than Rebecca's potential, in which my boundaries would always be characterized as obstacles rather than principles, in which my very success would be wielded against me as evidence that I deserved less rather than affirmation that I had earned what I built. "I need to be very clear about something," I said, setting down my napkin and meeting Mother's gaze directly. "I will not surrender my inheritance to fund Rebecca's business ventures. Not through voluntary trust modification, not through legal challenge, not through any mechanism whatsoever. The inheritance Dad designated for me is mine, not family resources subject to reallocation based on your assessment of comparative worthiness." The directness of my refusal, without qualification or softening, visibly startled both of them. My typical pattern in family conflicts had always involved attempts at compromise, at finding middle ground, at maintaining harmony even at personal cost. This unambiguous boundary represented a departure from established dynamics that neither of them had anticipated. "This isn't like you, Eleanor," Mother said after a moment, her tone shifting to concern tinged with disappointment. "This rigid, uncooperative attitude. I'm worried about what your work environment is doing to your sense of family obligation." The attempt to pathologize my boundary setting, to frame my self-protection as evidence of something wrong with me rather than something wrong with her demand, was so familiar it almost made me laugh. Almost. "What's not like me is openly acknowledging the pattern that's been operating in this family for years," I replied. "The pattern where Rebecca's potential perpetually outweighs my contributions, where her needs automatically supersede my boundaries, where my success becomes evidence that I should give up what's mine rather than confirmation that I've earned what I have." "That's an extremely ungenerous characterization," Mother began, but I wasn't finished. "You're literally suggesting I should surrender my inheritance because I've been responsible enough to build financial stability independently?" I continued. "Do you not see the fundamental injustice of that proposition? The perverse incentive it creates?" Rebecca finally broke her silence. "Ellie, I don't want to take your trust fund. That's not what this conversation was supposed to be about." But the damage was done. Whatever the original script had been, perhaps a more subtle approach toward the same objective, Mother's direct statement had revealed the underlying perspective that had been operating all along, that Rebecca's needs, by definition, outweighed my rights, that her potential justified any accommodation, including the appropriation of resources specifically designated for me. In that moment of clarity, something shifted irrevocably. The careful compartmentalization I had maintained, separating my professional identity from my family role, my financial expertise from my emotional connections, my individual autonomy from my daughterly compliance, collapsed into a single integrated recognition. I could not maintain my integrity while continuing to participate in a system that fundamentally devalued it. "I think I should leave now," I said, rising from the table with a calm that belied the seismic realignment occurring within me. "I need to get back to Chicago tonight, after all." "Eleanor, don't be dramatic," Mother said, her tone shifting to the authoritative register that had directed so much of my childhood. "We're having an important family discussion. You can't simply walk away when the conversation becomes challenging." But that was precisely what I could do. What I needed to do. Not as emotional retreat, but as necessary boundary enforcement. Not as evasion of difficult conversation, but as protection of fundamental principles. "I'm not walking away from a conversation," I clarified as I gathered my belongings. "I'm establishing a boundary that should never have needed articulation. My inheritance is not available for redistribution based on your assessment of comparative worthiness. That boundary is non-negotiable. Any conversation that doesn't respect it is one I won't participate in." As I moved toward the door, Mother called after me with a final attempt to reassert control through guilt. "Your father would be so disappointed by this selfishness, Eleanor. This isn't how he raised you to treat family." I paused, turning back one last time. Dad raised me to understand that true support sometimes means maintaining boundaries rather than removing them. That's what Mr. Winters reminded me of today, Dad's actual intentions, documented in his own words, not reinterpreted to suit current agendas. The mention of my conversation with Mr. Winters visibly startled Mother, suggesting she hadn't anticipated that he might have shared details about my father's explicit intentions regarding the trusts. "What exactly did Dominic tell you?" she asked, her confident certainty suddenly less assured. "Enough to understand that Dad's estate planning was even more carefully considered than I realized," I replied, "and that he anticipated exactly this type of situation arising." With that parting statement, deliberately ambiguous about how much I knew regarding the specific protective provisions, I left the house where I had grown up and walked to my car with the strange, lightening sensation of someone setting down a burden carried so long it had come to feel like part of myself. As I drove away from Lake Forest toward Chicago, the familiar route suddenly felt like a path toward something new. Not just a return to my apartment, but an advancement toward a reclaimed sense of self-worth and purpose that had nothing to do with family approval or acceptance of family narratives. The catalyst had come, not in the form I might have expected, but with perfect clarity nonetheless. Your sister deserves your trust fund more than you do. And in that moment of stark illumination, I had finally recognized the fundamental distortion that had shaped so many years of family dynamics, the underlying belief that Rebecca's needs inherently outweighed my rights, that her potential justified any accommodation, including the appropriation of what was rightfully mine, that my very success could be weaponized against me as evidence that I deserved less, rather than confirmation that I had earned what I built. The recognition wasn't just clarifying, it was liberating. For the first time in years, perhaps ever, I was driving toward Chicago, not with the weight of family expectations and unresolved tensions, but with the emerging lightness of someone who has finally named the unnameable, challenged the unchallengeable, and found firm ground on which to stand. Whatever came next would unfold on fundamentally different terms, terms that honored not just my father's tangible legacy, but the more important inheritance he had tried to give me, the understanding that true worth isn't measured by others' assessment of your value, but by your own commitment to the principles that define who you are. The Chicago skyline emerged through my windshield, its familiar architecture illuminated against the night sky. Under normal circumstances, this view signaled the conclusion of my obligatory family weekend, a return to the ordered world I had constructed for myself separate from Lake Forest dynamics. Tonight, it represented something more profound, a boundary not just geographic, but psychological. During the drive, my phone had buzzed repeatedly with messages from both Mother and Rebecca. I had silenced it after the third call, needing space to process what had transpired without the immediate pull of familial obligation. That simple act, choosing not to respond immediately, felt like a small revolution against decades of conditioned responsiveness. My apartment welcomed me with its familiar precision. Everything in its proper place, everything serving a specific function, a physical manifestation of the clarity I valued. I moved through my evening routine with mechanical efficiency while my mind continued processing the implications of Mother's declaration. Your sister deserves your trust fund more than you do. The statement contained layers of meaning beyond its literal assertion. It revealed a fundamental perspective that had operated beneath the surface of countless family interactions, that Rebecca's needs, by definition, outweighed my rights, that resources designated specifically for me could be reconsidered based not on my actions, but on her requirements, that my very success could be weaponized against me as justification for taking what was mine. Sleep eluded me despite physical exhaustion. Around 2 a.m., I gave up the attempt and moved to my home office, where I kept copies of key family documents. Opening my father's will and trust instruments, I began reviewing the provisions with fresh eyes, not as the daughter seeking familial harmony, but as the financial analyst evaluating structural integrity. The documents confirmed everything Mr. Winters had shared. My father had indeed created remarkable foresight mechanisms, provisions designed to protect both Rebecca and me from precisely the type of pressure I was now experiencing. His notes to the trustees, included in confidential addenda, revealed a deep understanding of family dynamics and potential vulnerabilities. One passage particularly resonated. Financial security is not merely about assets, but about agency, the freedom to make choices based on authentic values rather than immediate pressures. My daughters must be protected not only from external threats to their security, but from well-intentioned interference that might undermine their capacity for true self-determination. My father had understood what I was only beginning to fully grasp, that sometimes the greatest threat to genuine independence comes from those who believe they know better than you, what you need, what you deserve, and how your resources should be allocated. As dawn broke over Lake Michigan, illuminating my apartment with early morning light, I reached a decision that felt both unprecedented and inevitable. I could not continue participating in family dynamics that fundamentally devalued my autonomy, while claiming to support my best interests. The pattern had to break, not through emotional withdrawal, but through clear, consequence-backed boundaries. At precisely 8 a.m., I called Mr. Winters, who answered with the alertness of someone who had been expecting communication. "Eleanor," he greeted me, "I anticipated hearing from you this morning. I received several messages from your mother last night, though I haven't yet responded." Of course, Mother had attempted to engage Mr. Winters directly after my departure, likely to assess what he had shared with me, and to begin reshaping the narrative before I could act on the information. "I've made some decisions," I said without preamble, "about the trusts and my role moving forward." "I see," he replied carefully. "Would you like to discuss those decisions before they're finalized?" The question reflected his characteristic caution, a quality I had sometimes found frustrating but now deeply appreciated. Unlike nearly everyone else in my life, Mr. Winters consistently provided perspective without pressure, information without agenda. I believe it's time to activate the preservation clause, I stated, referring to the protective mechanism he had explained during our Sunday conversation. Rebecca's formal request for trust distributions for her new business venture would constitute the third speculative investment proposal within the specified timeframe. Before proceeding, I want to understand the full implications of this decision. Mr. Winters was silent for a moment, not from confusion, but from careful consideration. The preservation clause would automatically reduce quarterly distributions by 25% until the primary distribution age is reached. The reduction applies to the trust subject to repeated distribution requests, in this case, Rebecca's trust, not yours. Would this affect the principal distribution at age 35? I asked. No. The principal remains intact and becomes fully accessible as originally scheduled. The clause affects only the interim quarterly distributions. This was significant. The mechanism wasn't punitive but protective, designed to maintain the core security my father had established while creating a constraint against repeated attempts to access principal prematurely. And my role as co-trustee? Would activating this provision affect my authority or responsibilities? Not directly, Mr. Winters clarified. However, I should note that invoking protective provisions often leads to increased friction between trustees and beneficiaries. Your relationship with Rebecca and your mother would likely experience additional strain. The assessment was accurate, but ultimately irrelevant to my decision. Last night's dinner had already fractured whatever pretense of normal family relations we had maintained. Adding formal financial consequences wouldn't create the rift. It would merely acknowledge what already existed. I understand, I said. I'm prepared for that eventuality. What's the process for formally evaluating Rebecca's business proposal and potentially activating the preservation clause? Mr. Winters outlined the necessary steps. A formal review of the business plan against established criteria, documentation of the evaluation process, comparison with previous investment requests, and consultation between trustees before reaching a determination. Given the circumstances, I would recommend an independent third-party evaluation of the business proposal, he suggested. This creates an objective assessment that neither trustee could be accused of prejudicing. The recommendation was sound, providing a buffer against inevitable accusations of bias while ensuring the evaluation adhered to professional standards rather than family dynamics. I agree, I said. Please arrange for an appropriate consultant with expertise in import-export ventures and textile businesses specifically. I'll identify several candidates for your approval, he promised. Now, there's another matter we should discuss. Your mother implied in her messages that she's considering legal action regarding your position as co-trustee. While I believe such action would be unsuccessful, litigation itself can be costly and disruptive regardless of outcome. This matched my own assessment after reviewing the trust documents overnight. Mother's position lacked legal merit, but pursuing it would consume trust resources and create prolonged conflict. What would you recommend as the most prudent approach? I asked, valuing his professional judgment. Transparency and documentation, he replied without hesitation. Continue executing your trustee responsibilities with meticulous attention to proper procedure. Maintain clear records of all decisions and their alignment with trust provisions. And perhaps most importantly, separate personal family dynamics from fiduciary responsibilities in all communications. The advice paralleled my professional principles, approaching complex situations through systematic process rather than emotional reaction. This was familiar territory, applying my analytical strengths to navigate unfamiliar emotional terrain. I appreciate your guidance, I said. There's one other matter I'd like to address, my own trust fund. Yes? Mr. Winters' tone remained neutral, though I sensed heightened attention. I'd like to explore options for strengthening the protective provisions on my trust specifically. Given Mother's explicit statement that she believes my trust should be redirected to Rebecca, I'm concerned about potential attempts to access or influence those assets through means we haven't yet anticipated. The request seemed to confirm something Mr. Winters had perhaps already considered. Your father included several options for enhancing protection under specific circumstances. One such option was the appointment of an additional independent co-trustee, creating a 3-person trustee structure that would require majority agreement for any significant changes. That sounds appropriate, I agreed. Would you recommend someone specific for that role? I would suggest Marianne Chen from Ardent Fiduciary Services. She's exceptionally experienced with complex family trust situations and brings both technical expertise and diplomatic skill to sensitive cases. I made a note of the name, already feeling the slight easing of tension that comes with actionable steps toward resolution. Please initiate that process as well. Of course, Mr. Winters said. And Eleanor, if I may offer a personal observation? Your father would be proud of how you're handling this situation. He valued clarity and principle, particularly when they required courage to maintain. The unexpected validation from someone who had known my father so well brought a sudden tightness to my throat. Thank you. That means a great deal. After ending the call, I moved to my kitchen to prepare coffee, the familiar ritual providing space for my thoughts to settle. The decisions I had made were significant, potentially creating permanent alterations to family relationships that had defined much of my life. Yet they felt necessary not just for financial protection, but for psychological preservation. My phone, which I had finally unmuted, buzzed with a new message. James checking in after not hearing from me last night. Everything okay with the family visit? You usually text when you're back in the city. The simple expression of attentiveness, noticing my pattern without demanding immediate response, highlighted the contrast between relationships built on mutual respect versus those constructed around obligation and compliance. James had never attempted to override my decisions or reframe my boundaries as character flaws. He had never suggested that my success somehow diminished my rights or justified others' claims on my resources. Back in Chicago, I replied. Family. Weekend took an unexpected turn. Have time for dinner tonight? Could use a neutral perspective. His response came immediately. Absolutely. My place at 7? I'll cook. The offer reflected his understanding of what I needed. Private space to process complex emotions rather than the public setting of a restaurant. This thoughtfulness represented exactly what healthy support looked like, recognizing needs without presuming to override autonomy. As morning progressed into afternoon, I turned my attention to work, finding comfort in the familiar challenges of financial analysis and investment strategy. My ability to compartmentalize, often criticized by Mother as emotional unavailability, served as a valuable tool for maintaining professional functionality despite personal turmoil. Around 2 p.m., my office phone rang with a call from my division director, Margaret Chen. No relation to the fiduciary specialist Mr. Winters had recommended. Eleanor, she began without preamble, the Westridge proposal you developed has been approved by the executive committee. They were particularly impressed with your risk mitigation strategy. The client wants to move forward immediately and has specifically requested you as lead analyst for implementation. The news should have been exciting, professional recognition, and a significant advancement opportunity. Instead, it arrived as a muted positive against the backdrop of personal upheaval. That's excellent news, I responded, my professional voice automatically engaging. When would they like to begin the implementation phase? That's actually why I'm calling, Margaret said. The timeline is ambitious. They want to launch within 30 days. This would require your focused attention, possibly including some weekends over the next month. Before committing your availability, I wanted to ensure you don't have any significant conflicts. The timing was striking in its synchronicity, a professional opportunity that would justify reduced availability for family obligations exactly when I needed legitimate space from those dynamics. My schedule can accommodate that timeline, I confirmed. I'll need to adjust some personal commitments, but nothing that can't be rearranged. Excellent. We'll schedule the kickoff meeting for Wednesday morning. And, Eleanor, this is a significant vote of confidence from both the committee and the client. Your consistent performance has earned this recognition. After the call, I sat with the parallel realities of my professional and personal experiences. In my career, consistent performance created increasing opportunity and recognition. My reliability was valued rather than expected, my expertise acknowledged rather than minimized. The contrast with my family dynamics couldn't have been starker. The same qualities that advanced my professional standing were precisely those used to justify diminishing my personal autonomy and rights. By late afternoon, I had received multiple additional messages from both Mother and Rebecca, escalating in tone from confusion to concern, to indignation at my continued silence. I crafted a single, concise response to both. I need space to process yesterday's conversation. I'll be in touch when I'm ready to discuss next steps regarding Rebecca's business proposal and the trust evaluation process. The deliberate shift from emotional family dynamics to formal financial procedure wasn't accidental. It established the terms on which I was willing to re-engage, not as the dutiful daughter seeking approval, but as the co-trustee executing fiduciary responsibilities with appropriate professional boundaries. That evening, as I prepared to meet James for dinner, I examined my reflection in the bathroom mirror with unusual attention. The face looking back at me was familiar, yet somehow changed, not in physical features, but in expression. Something had shifted in my eyes, a clarity that hadn't been there before, a certainty about boundaries that would no longer flex under familiar pressures. Mother's declaration, "Your sister deserves your trust fund more than you do," had provided the catalyst for this transformation. But the resolution now forming wasn't merely reactive. It was foundational, a decision to align my actions with my values, to honor my father's actual intentions, rather than their convenient reinterpretation, and most importantly, to trust my own judgment, even when those closest to me questioned its validity. As I left my apartment, phone deliberately left behind to ensure uninterrupted conversation with James, I carried with me not just the weight of difficult decisions made, but also the emerging lightness of authentic alignment between my internal principles and external actions. Whatever came next, whether legal challenges, family estrangement, or eventual reconciliation on new terms, would unfold from this foundation of clarity rather than the quicksand of shifting expectations and conditional acceptance that had characterized so much of my family experience. The resolution wasn't about rejecting family connection, but about establishing the only terms on which genuine connection could exist: mutual respect, clear boundaries, and the acknowledgement that support means honoring autonomy rather than overriding it. My father had understood this principle well enough to build it into the very structure of his estate planning. Now I would honor that understanding by maintaining its integrity, not just as financial stewardship, but as philosophical alignment with the legacy he had truly intended. The weekend following Rebecca's office confrontation passed with unusual quietness. No calls from Mother, no texts demanding explanation or expressing disappointment, no emotional appeals from Rebecca. The silence itself constituted a form of communication, strategic withdrawal rather than genuine respect for boundaries, but it provided welcome space for focus on the Westridge project launch preparations. Monday morning arrived with crisp autumn clarity, Chicago's skyline sharp against a cloudless sky as I prepared for the scheduled conference call with Mr. Winters. Before our appointment, I reviewed the consultant's report one final time, ensuring I could speak to specific concerns rather than general impressions if the conversation required detailed analysis. Mr. Winters connected precisely at the scheduled time, his tone carrying the measured professionalism that had guided our interactions since my father's passing. "Good morning, Eleanor. Before we begin our formal discussion of the consultant's findings, I should inform you of developments that may impact our deliberations." The careful phrasing immediately signaled sensitive information. "What developments?" "I received a rather concerning email from your mother late Friday evening, followed by a phone call from Rebecca yesterday afternoon. Both communications contained similar substance. Allegations that your personal relationship with your sister has compromised your objectivity as trustee, specifically regarding evaluation of her business proposal." Though not entirely unexpected, the formal escalation of Mother's threatened legal challenge still struck with surprising force. "I see. What specifically are they alleging?" "The essential claim is that you selected a consultant predisposed to find fault with Rebecca's business model, thereby ensuring rejection of her distribution request and triggering the preservation clause. Your mother characterizes this as deliberate sabotage motivated by long-standing sibling rivalry rather than legitimate fiduciary concerns. The allegations represented classic projection, attributing to me precisely the manipulation they had attempted through Carlton's selection based on his connection to Mr. Winters and their coordinated campaign to pressure trust distributions, despite evident viability concerns." "That's quite an accusation," I observed neutrally, "particularly given that you identified potential consultants and we jointly selected someone with relevant expertise and no prior connection to either party." "Indeed," Mr. Winters agreed. "The allegation lacks substantive merit. However, your mother has indicated intention to pursue formal petition for your removal as co-trustee if Rebecca's distribution request is denied. While such petition would almost certainly fail on legal merits, the process itself could prove disruptive and potentially damaging to family relationships." The implied suggestion was clear. Consider approving Rebecca's distribution request despite legitimate concerns to avoid family legal conflict. This approach, sacrificing principle for harmony, boundaries for approval, represented exactly the pattern I had determined to break. "What would you recommend as the most appropriate course of action?" I asked, genuinely interested in his perspective without being bound by it. Mr. Winters' response was measured but clear. "Speaking purely as trustee rather than family advisor, our responsibility is to evaluate distribution requests according to established criteria, regardless of potential relational consequences. The consultant's report identifies substantial concerns that would typically justify denial under normal evaluation standards." "And speaking as someone who knew my father well?" His voice softened slightly. "Jonathan valued harmony but never at the expense of principle. He established these structures precisely to ensure that emotional pressure wouldn't override prudent financial management. I believe he would consider this situation validation of his foresight rather than failure of family cohesion. The assessment aligned with my own understanding of my father's values. His commitment to maintaining appropriate boundaries, even when doing so, created temporary discomfort or conflict. Then our path seems clear, I concluded. We should proceed with standard evaluation protocol based on the consultant's findings and our fiduciary responsibilities, regardless of potential legal threats. Agreed, Mr. Winters said, his tone returning to formal professionalism. The official determination will be documented as joint trustee decision based on independent expert assessment, rather than personal judgment of either trustee. This creates clear record of appropriate process should any legal challenge materialize. We proceeded to discuss specific findings from the consultant's report, identifying key concerns that substantiated denial of Rebecca's distribution request. Unrealistic profit projections, underestimated import costs, insufficient regulatory compliance planning, and inadequate risk mitigation strategies. The determination wasn't punitive but protective. Recognition that releasing significant trust principal for a venture with such fundamental viability concerns would constitute neglect of fiduciary responsibility. "I'll prepare the formal notification documents today," Mr. Winters concluded. "Given the circumstances, would you prefer I communicate the determination to Rebecca directly, or would you like to be involved in that conversation?" The question required careful consideration. Removing myself from direct communication might reduce immediate conflict but could appear as avoidance or delegation of responsibility. Participating directly would likely trigger immediate emotional confrontation, but would demonstrate willingness to stand behind difficult decisions rather than hiding behind legal structures. "I believe we should communicate the determination jointly," I decided, "perhaps through video conference rather than written notification alone. Difficult messages should be delivered with appropriate directness and opportunity for questions, even when they're unlikely to be well received." Mr. Winters' slight smile suggested approval of this approach. A wise choice, professional but humane. "I'll have my assistant coordinate scheduling for later this week, assuming that timeline aligns with your availability." "It does," I confirmed. "And regarding the preservation clause, that will activate automatically with this determination." "Yes. The system will register this as the third request within the specified time frame, triggering the protective reduction in quarterly distributions. The first reduced payment would occur at the next scheduled distribution date." We concluded our call with agreement to connect again before the joint notification meeting with Rebecca. As I turned my attention to the Westridge project materials awaiting review, my phone buzzed with an incoming call from Mother, timing too precise to be coincidental. Normally, I would have answered immediately, conditioned to prioritize family communications regardless of professional obligations. Today, different boundaries applied. I silenced the call and continued with my scheduled work, sending a brief text once I reached a natural breakpoint. "In meetings until 2 p.m., available to talk after 3 p.m. if still needed." This small assertion of professional boundaries, determining when family communications would be addressed rather than allowing them to override scheduled responsibilities, represented significant shift in established patterns. Not rudeness, but appropriate demarcation between personal and professional obligations. Mother's response came immediately. "This is urgent. Family crisis takes precedence over work meetings." The framing was familiar. Family crisis, automatically, outranking any other commitment, the implicit expectation that I would drop everything to address whatever issue Mother deemed urgent. This pattern had operated so long I had ceased to question its validity until recent events forced reevaluation. I responded with simple clarity. "I understand this feels urgent. I'm available after 3 p.m. for full conversation with appropriate attention. If truly emergency situation, please text specific details so I can assess whether immediate interruption of client work is warranted." Setting this boundary, distinguishing between genuine emergency and emotional urgency, felt both necessary and uncomfortable, challenging decades of conditioned responsiveness to family demands regardless of their actual time sensitivity. No. Further messages arrived before my afternoon meetings concluded. At precisely 3 p.m., I called Mother directly, having completed my professional obligations and created space for whatever conversation might unfold. "Finally," she answered on the first ring, her tone sharp with indignation. "I've been waiting all day for you to remember your family obligations." I was fulfilling professional commitments that couldn't be interrupted without significant consequences, I explained calmly. "I'm available now with full attention for whatever concerns you wanted to discuss." "Rebecca told me about your conversation Friday," Mother continued without acknowledging my explanation. "Your coldness toward her was shocking, Eleanor. This corporate environment has changed you, hardened you against your own family." The accusation, framing boundary maintenance as personality defect, was familiar enough to be almost comforting in its predictability. My position regarding trust. Distributions remains consistent with fiduciary responsibilities established by Dad's estate planning. The consultant's assessment identified significant concerns with Rebecca's business proposal that would make trust funding imprudent by any objective standard. Objective? Mother's laugh held no humor. There's nothing objective about your vendetta against your sister's success. You've orchestrated this entire evaluation process to ensure rejection and trigger that punitive clause reducing her distributions. The allegations mirrored what Mr. Winters had described from their written communications: projection of manipulation, while denying legitimate concerns identified by independent assessment. The weekend following Rebecca's office confrontation passed with unusual quietness. No calls from Mother, no texts demanding explanation or expressing disappointment, no emotional appeals from Rebecca. The silence itself constituted a form of communication, strategic withdrawal rather than genuine respect for boundaries, but it provided welcome space for focus on the West Ridge project launch preparations. Monday morning arrived with crisp autumn clarity, Chicago's skyline sharp against a cloudless sky, as I prepared for the scheduled conference call with Mr. Winters. Before our appointment, I reviewed the consultant's report one final time, ensuring I could speak to specific concerns rather than general impressions if the conversation required detailed analysis. Mr. Winters connected precisely at the scheduled time, his tone carrying the measured professionalism that had guided our interactions since my father's passing. Good morning, Eleanor. Before we begin our formal discussion of the consultant's findings, I should inform you of developments that may impact our deliberations. The careful phrasing immediately signaled sensitive information. What developments? I received a rather concerning email from your mother late Friday evening, followed by a phone call from Rebecca yesterday afternoon. Both communications contained similar substance. Allegations that your personal relationship with your sister has compromised your objectivity as trustee, specifically regarding evaluation of her business proposal. Though not entirely unexpected, the formal escalation of Mother's threatened legal challenge still struck with surprising force. I see. What specifically are they alleging? The essential claim is that you selected a consultant predisposed to find fault with Rebecca's business model, thereby ensuring rejection of her distribution request and triggering the preservation clause. Your mother characterizes this as deliberate sabotage motivated by long-standing sibling rivalry rather than legitimate fiduciary concerns. The allegations represented classic projection, attributing to me precisely the manipulation they had attempted through Carlton's selection based on his connection to Mr. Winters and their coordinated campaign to pressure trust distributions, despite evident viability concerns. That's quite an accusation, I observed neutrally, particularly given that you identified potential consultants and we jointly selected someone with relevant expertise and no prior connection to either party. Indeed, Mr. Winters agreed. The allegation lacks substantive merit. However, your mother has indicated intention to pursue formal petition for your removal as co-trustee if Rebecca's distribution request is denied. While such petition would almost certainly fail on legal merits, the process itself could prove disruptive and potentially damaging to family relationships. The implied suggestion was clear. Consider approving Rebecca's distribution request despite legitimate concerns to avoid family legal conflict. This approach, sacrificing principle for harmony, boundaries for approval, represented exactly the pattern I had determined to break. What would you recommend as the most appropriate course of action? I asked, genuinely interested in his perspective without being bound by it. Mr. Winters' response was measured but clear. Speaking purely as trustee rather than family advisor, our responsibility is to evaluate distribution requests according to established criteria, regardless of potential relational consequences. The consultant's report identifies substantial concerns that would typically justify denial under normal evaluation standards. and speaking as someone who knew my father well. His voice softened slightly. Jonathan valued harmony but never at the expense of principle. He established these structures precisely to ensure that emotional pressure wouldn't override prudent financial management. I believe he would consider this situation validation of his foresight rather than failure of family cohesion. The assessment aligned with my own understanding of my father's values. His commitment to maintaining appropriate boundaries, even when doing so created temporary discomfort or conflict. Then our path seems clear, I concluded. We should proceed with standard evaluation protocol based on the consultant's findings and our fiduciary responsibilities, regardless of potential legal threats. Agreed, Mr. Winters said, his tone returning to formal professionalism. The official determination will be documented as joint trustee decision based on independent expert assessment rather than personal judgment of either trustee. This creates clear record of appropriate process should any legal challenge materialize. We proceeded to discuss specific findings from the consultant's report, identifying key concerns that substantiated denial of Rebecca's distribution request. Unrealistic profit projections, underestimated import costs, insufficient regulatory compliance planning, and inadequate risk mitigation strategies. The determination wasn't punitive but protective. Recognition that releasing significant trust principal for a venture with such fundamental viability concerns would constitute neglect of fiduciary responsibility. I'll prepare the formal notification documents today, Mr. Winters concluded. Given the circumstances, would you prefer I communicate the determination to Rebecca directly, or would you like to be involved in that conversation? The question required careful consideration. Removing myself from direct communication might reduce immediate conflict but could appear as avoidance or delegation of responsibility. Participating directly would likely trigger immediate emotional confrontation, but would demonstrate willingness to stand behind difficult decisions rather than hiding behind legal structures. I believe we should communicate the determination jointly, I decided, perhaps through video conference rather than written notification alone. Difficult messages should be delivered with appropriate directness and opportunity for questions, even when they're unlikely to be well received. Mr. Winters' slight smile suggested approval of this approach. A wise choice. Professional but humane. I'll have my assistant coordinate scheduling for later this week, assuming that timeline aligns with your availability. It does, I confirmed. And regarding the preservation clause, that will activate automatically with this determination? Yes, the system will register this as the third request within the specified time frame, triggering the protective reduction in quarterly distributions. The first reduced payment would occur at the next scheduled distribution date. We concluded our call with agreement to connect again before the joint notification meeting with Rebecca. As I turned my attention to the Westridge project materials awaiting review, my phone buzzed with an incoming call from Mother, timing too precise to be coincidental. Normally, I would have answered immediately, conditioned to prioritize family communications regardless of professional obligations. Today, different boundaries applied. I silenced the call and continued with my scheduled work, sending a brief text once I reached a natural break point. In meetings until 2 p.m. available. To talk after 3 p.m. if still needed. This small assertion of professional boundaries, determining when family communications would be addressed rather than allowing them to override scheduled responsibilities, represented significant shift in established patterns. Not rudeness, but appropriate demarcation between personal and professional obligations. Mother's response came immediately. This is urgent. Family crisis takes precedence over work meetings. The framing was familiar. Family crisis, automatically outranking any other commitment. The implicit expectation that I would drop everything to address whatever issue Mother deemed urgent. This pattern had operated so long I had ceased to question its validity until recent events forced reevaluation. I responded with simple clarity. I understand this feels urgent. I'm available after 3 p.m. for full conversation with appropriate attention. If truly emergency situation, please text specific details so I can assess whether immediate interruption of client work is warranted. Setting this boundary, distinguishing between genuine emergency and emotional urgency, felt both necessary and uncomfortable, challenging decades of conditioned responsiveness to family demands regardless of their actual time sensitivity. No further messages arrived before my afternoon. Meetings concluded. At precisely 3 p.m., I called Mother directly, having completed my professional obligations and created space for whatever conversation might unfold. "Finally," she answered on the first ring, her tone sharp with indignation. "I've been waiting all day for you to remember your family obligations." I was fulfilling professional commitments that couldn't be interrupted without significant consequences, I explained calmly. "I'm available now with full attention for whatever concerns you wanted to discuss." "Rebecca told me about your conversation Friday," Mother continued without acknowledging my explanation. "Your coldness toward her was shocking, Eleanor. This corporate environment has changed you, hardened you against your own family." The accusation, framing boundary maintenance as personality defect, was familiar enough to be almost comforting in its predictability. My position regarding trust distributions remains consistent with fiduciary responsibilities established by Dad's estate planning. The consultant's assessment identified significant concerns with Rebecca's business proposal that would make trust funding imprudent by any objective standard. "Objective?" Mother's laugh held no humor. "There's nothing objective about your vendetta against your sister's success. You've orchestrated this entire evaluation process to ensure rejection and trigger that punitive clause reducing her distributions." The allegations mirrored what Mr. Winters had described from their written communications, projection of manipulation, while denying legitimate concerns identified by independent assessment. "The preservation clause isn't punitive, but protective," I clarified. "Dad included it specifically to prevent trust depletion through serial entrepreneurial ventures before financial maturity is reached. And the evaluation process followed standard protocol with independent expert assessment, not personal judgment." "Your father would be ashamed of how you're treating your sister," Mother declared, escalating to her most potent emotional leverage, invocation of my father's supposed disappointment. He believed in supporting family dreams, not obstructing them with legalistic objections. In previous years, this particular tactic had proven remarkably effective. The suggestion that I was betraying my father's values by maintaining boundaries he had specifically established. Today, with clearer understanding of his actual documented intentions, the manipulation was transparent rather than devastating. "Dad's estate planning reflected his values quite explicitly," I responded, keeping my voice measured despite the provocative accusation. "He established specific protection mechanisms precisely because he anticipated this type of situation arising. The trust structures aren't about constraining dreams, but about ensuring long-term security regardless of short-term entrepreneurial outcomes." "You're twisting his intentions to justify your own obstruction," Mother insisted. "Dominic may have filled your head with technical interpretations, but I knew Jonathan's heart. He would want his resources supporting Rebecca's vision, not sitting idle while she struggles to establish herself." The reframing was remarkable, asserting emotional authority to override documented intentions, positioning formal estate planning as technical distortion rather than explicit expression of values and priorities. "Mr. Winters and I will be meeting with Rebecca later this week to discuss the determination regarding her distribution request," I said, steering the conversation toward concrete next steps rather than circular debate about interpretations. The consultant's report identifies specific concerns that would need addressing before any significant investment would be prudent, information that could actually strengthen her business concept if approached constructively. "So that's your final position?" Mother demanded. Denying your sister access to funds that could change her life based on some consultant's nitpicking about projections and procedures? The determination reflects standard fiduciary evaluation of distribution requests according to established criteria, I confirmed. This isn't personal judgment but professional assessment of viability and risk factors relevant to prudent trust administration. Mother's voice took on the dangerous quietness that had always preceded her most significant emotional escalations. You leave me no choice, Eleanor. I had hoped you might reconsider your position, but your callousness makes clear that formal intervention has become necessary. I'll be consulting with legal counsel regarding petition for your removal as co-trustee on grounds of compromised objectivity and conflict of interest. Though Mr. Winters had prepared me for this possibility, hearing Mother formally declare intention to pursue legal action against her own daughter still carried surprising emotional impact, not fear of outcome. The petition had virtually no chance of success given the trust documentation, but sadness at the relationship deterioration such action represented. That's your prerogative, I acknowledged calmly. Though before proceeding, you might want to consider that any legal challenge would require full disclosure of all trust provisions in court records, including Dad's explicit guidance regarding his intentions and the protective mechanisms he established. Public revelation of those provisions might create greater family discord than working within existing structures. Are you threatening me? Mother's voice sharpened with indignation. Not at all, I clarified. Simply noting factual consequences of potential legal action that you may want to consider before determining your course. Litigation inevitably creates public record of matters that might otherwise remain private family business. The measured warning, delivered without emotional escalation, appeared to register more effectively than I had anticipated. Mother's tone shifted from righteously indignant to calculatingly thoughtful. Perhaps we should discuss this situation in person, she suggested after brief pause. These matters are too complex for phone conversation. I could drive into the city tomorrow. We could have lunch and explore potential compromises that might satisfy everyone's concerns. The sudden pivot to conciliation after explicit legal threat represented familiar pattern. Escalation, followed by strategic retreat when direct confrontation proved ineffective, creating appearance of reasonable engagement while seeking alternative route to original objective. I appreciate the suggestion, I replied. However, my schedule this week is fully committed with the Westridge implementation launch. Additionally, I believe we should address Rebecca's distribution request through proper formal channels before exploring any alternative arrangements. Mr. Winters will be coordinating the joint meeting later this week. Setting this boundary, declining immediate in-person engagement while maintaining appropriate professional process, felt both necessary and liberating. Not rejection of relationship, but establishment of healthy engagement patterns that couldn't be manipulated through familiar emotional leverage. Mother's disappointment manifested as audible sigh. You've changed, Eleanor. Become someone I hardly recognize. This rigid, uncooperative attitude isn't how we raised you. I haven't fundamentally changed, I clarified gently. I've simply stopped accepting the premise that my boundaries matter less than others' desires, that my success justifies taking what's mine rather than confirming I've earned what I have, that my competence somehow obligates me to accommodate choices I wouldn't make for myself. The directness of my response, naming underlying dynamics without softening or qualification, created momentary silence on the line. When Mother spoke again, her voice carried unfamiliar uncertainty. We'll speak again after your meeting with Rebecca, she said finally. Think carefully about your priorities, Eleanor. Family relationships outlast trust funds and corporate achievements. After the call ended, I remained at my desk, processing the conversation not with anxiety but with surprising clarity. The familiar emotional triggers, accusations of selfishness, invocation of my father's supposed disappointment, suggestions of personality defect rather than principle, had registered but not destabilized my position. The aftermath of confrontation wasn't proving easy, certainly, but neither was it producing the devastating emotional impact such conflicts had historically generated. Setting and maintaining boundaries, not from anger but from clear-eyed assessment of healthy engagement patterns, was creating new foundation for potential relationship reconstruction, should Mother and Rebecca eventually choose to meet me there. As afternoon light shifted across my office, I turned my attention back to the Westridge materials, grateful for the focused productivity my professional work provided. Whatever storm might continue brewing in family dynamics, I remained, anchored in purpose and principle rather than approval-seeking or obligation-driven compliance. The path forward wouldn't be simple or painless, but it would be authentic, grounded in respect for both my father's actual intentions and my own inherent worth beyond utility to others. That foundation, however initially uncomfortable for everyone involved, offered the only genuine possibility for eventual relationships based on mutual respect rather than hierarchical needs and conditional acceptance. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.